Thank you everyone for joining us. Today's first speaker, our keynote speaker, is Eduardo Garcia-Molina. And Eduardo is a PhD candidate in classics at the University of Chicago. His dissertation examines the interconnected role that archival information, administration, and communication had on the formation of Seleukid order among the local ecologies of the heterogeneous empire. He is particularly interested in the effects that archives had on Hellenistic law and their implications for the treatment of ancient states. He has a broader interest in notions of state power in antiquity, gender, and imperial ideology, Greco-Roman attitudes towards the Seleucids and Eastern peoples and polities, ancient archives, numismatics, and epigraphy. In addition to his primary work on the Seleucids, Eduardo also works on the reception of Greco-Roman antiquity in the Caribbean and archaeogaming, with a particular focus on how ancient states are rendered within the mechanics of modern video games. Thank you again, Eduardo, for accepting our invitation, and I'm very excited to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Before I start my spiel, let me just do the old awkward shuffle of making sure that this is one thing that I don't miss about hybrid conferences. But I think everybody should be able to see the screen. So without further ado, let me get started. So thank you, Samuel, for that introduction. And thank you to the Malta Classics Association for this invitation to give the keynote address. It is a great personal honor to be considered, and I hope that I do not squander the faith they have in me. It must also be stated that parts of my talk will revolve around a region that is currently subject to the horrors of war. It is irresponsible to look back at lands and peoples in the past while ignoring the present, and I hope compassionate diplomacy will quickly replace more displacement, suffering, and death. I must, rather sheepishly, admit that I have never given such an address before. I have attended several, and so can only hope to ape from these available exempla. To that end, I will be upfront in disclosing the structure of this talk and what I believe should be the aim of a conference keynote. I intend to give a brief overview of the term Hellenistic and the state of modern Hellenistic historiography, present a brief case study of my own relating to the participation of subjects in the Seleukid military, and conclude by widening the scope once more to ideally serve as a way to employ the dynamism and interdisciplinarity found in the study of the period as a kind of launching point for the varied and exciting scholarship to be presented by my colleagues in this conference. Now that I have revealed my cards, as it were, I leave it up to you to decide their efficacy in reaching these aims. The late Roman historian Paul Vane wrote in his treatment on the writing of history that l'histoire est connaissance mutilée, when discussing the fragmentary nature of documentary evidence. Do pardon my own mutilation of the French language. Roughly 2,000 and some years earlier, the Greek historian Polybius wrote that viewing history through the lens of a singular strand, be it the history of a city or just a lone prominent figure, is akin to inspecting a single part of an animal's carcass and assuming you know how the whole functions when it was formerly alive. Both historians are discussing slightly different aspects. Vane, the notion of historical knowledge as a sort of amalgam of documents and the illusion of a integral reconstitution, and Polybius, the difference in what we may call today historical case studies as opposed to something like global histories. Both, however, use this carnal aspect when conceptualizing human history, and it is this corporeality, the fleshiness, the humanness of it all that I am drawn to. Why do I begin with this aspect that has me sounding more like Cronenberg than Barthold Niebuhr? It is this notion of history as the composite graft of the body parts of antiquity, stitched and sewn together by the historian, driven by the ultimate want of perceiving and recreating the actuality of how it breathed, how it moved, how it lived. Inevitably, this requires the toll of the historian in scrounging parts, but the twine with which we stitch up our historical amalgams are largely provided by our own human thoughts and experiences. There are some that reject this notion, more and more seeking to raise history as a quantifiable objective science in the face of an increasingly modern, inhuman world. To be sure, history has benefited immensely from such approaches by allowing us to gather more parts or scrutinize the placement and quality of those we already have. But we would be remiss if we do not remind ourselves and embrace that what we do, turning our gaze back and reaching for the past, is grounded in an intrinsically human drive. I say this because the history of the Hellenistic states and more generally of the period, is the history of its historians and classicists as much as it is the history of the people of the period. Often, when creating our historical amalgam, parts are missing. It is impossible to even comprehend the totality of the construct as it once stood in antiquity. To make up for this, the historian offers their own parts in the reconstruction of the whole, and it is this transactional pound of flesh that allows us to conceive of the ways that historians have defined and shaped the Hellenistic period. I will not attempt a comprehensive summation of Hellenistic historians. We would be here until the next year at least, as I list off Caniotis, Goethe, Bickerman, Prue, Green, Beatty, and Habak, Wallbank, Manning, Lorber, Dottie, Ma, Meadows, Bresson, and many more. I will briefly focus on 3 historians. For those who are familiar with the subject, I ask forgiveness for the cursory nature of this section, and I fixate on that elusive word, Hellenistic, and have chosen to focus on a pivotal figure in Hellenistic history, Mikhail Ivanovich Rostovtsev. The great human wrecking ball that was Alexander III energized the process of multilateral cultural diffusion that already possessed a storied history spanning millennia before. However, even in antiquity, this event exacerbated the coagulation of something we can call a monolithic notion of Greek, itself used to denote a variety of communities, and the otherized, abstracted, immobile East, still palpable even in modern terminology, where East is still used as an amorphous determiner for not Italy, not Greece, and sometimes Anatolia, depending on the day of the week. The 19th century German scholar Johann Gustav Droysen first coined the term Hellenistic in his 2-volume work, Geschichte des Hellenismus, published in 1836 and 1843, to describe the period following Alexander's conquest as Greek civilization, imagining itself in the Eastern world under the banner of Alexander. Rostovtsev saw in the Hellenistic period a more complex picture rather than some grand design of Alexander, a common depiction firmly entrenched in the preceding centuries of European colonization and bolstered by rosy depictions of a great learned unifier in our ancient sources. One simply has to read Plutarch. Rostovtsev's command of documentary evidence and insistence on the recognition of Near Eastern history before Alexander is still considered exemplary. After leaving Russia in 1918, following the revolution, Rostovtsev eventually settled in the US and was a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and then Yale. Baumgarten notes that Rostovtsev's status as an emigre within the spheres of Western European academia and his experiences with political shifts, both in Russia and in the broader world, especially in the Middle East, from the 1910s to the 1930s, shaped his perception of the Hellenistic period. For instance, you can see his modern Marxist terminology when discussing the ancient economy, or his notion of Greek civilization attracting non-Greeks, creating a sort of Greek cosmopolitanism that mirrors his own situation within academia as an outsider being accepted into its ranks. This is not to say that we should not challenge his ideas, like his notion of a monolithic Greek civilization, even as he discards race and its dominance, even in depictions of hybridization, or remind ourselves that many archaeological expeditions in the region, including Rostovtsev's participation within Dura Europos, were the direct result of European military intervention and served as prestige projects for collections within Western academic institutions, alongside, of course, their research aims. Are we too, in the panic parlance of the present, cancel him? No, but we must recognize these contribute to Rostovtsev's historiographical pound of flesh. They are the parts and the twine with which he creates his construct. Describing his historical method in a letter to Rinosuke Awano, Rostovtsev cites 2 principles, quote, first, the necessity of treating social and economic problems in their historical evolution, that is to say, in the light of the general development of the ancient world, not in their artificial antiquarian isolation, and second, quote, that any study of any corner of ancient life must not be based on a dry accumulation of facts, but on an organic coordination of them. History is a piece of life, and each phenomenon studied by the historian must be visualized by him, that is to say, appear before him as a picture of life, not as a theoretical abstraction, end quote. Rostovtsev sought life in his pursuit of antiquity, and through his construct, instilled with pieces of his own life, he energized the field of Hellenistic studies. It is precisely this human component that gives texture to the term Hellenistic beyond its usage as the title for a historical period. I wish to compare Rostovtsev very briefly to two other scholars that I greatly admire, Amélie Kurt and Susan Sherwin-White. Both were dynamic scholars in their own right and influenced Hellenistic history further through their joint undertaking of first an interdisciplinary international seminar at the Institute of Classical Studies titled Hellenism in the East, that resulted in a compiled volume in 1987, and second, the publication of a book in 1993 that, and I believe I'm not being hyperbolic in my assessment, shook our notion of Hellenistic by tackling the largest of the Hellenistic kingdoms, the Seleukid Empire. The opening line from Samarkand to Sardis is a bold declaration rooted in frustration over the characterization of the Seleukids in scholarship as a nominally Greek state plopped onto the east. Quote, the title of this book expresses our firmly held view that the Seleukid Empire was an Eastern empire centered in the Middle East, particularly the Fertile Crescent, i.e. Mesopotamia, North Syria, and Western Iran, end quote. Kurt, as a Near Eastern historian, had encountered similar challenges when participating in the Achaemenid history workshop that sought to dislodge that empire from its depictions in Greek literary sources that had largely dominated previous scholarship. Sherwin-White first researched ancient Kos before turning to Seleukid Mesopotamia, then dedicating herself to helping children as a psychotherapist. They both introduced new segments built from their mutual experiences in a field that had been largely defined by Greek sources and ancient historians of Greece and Rome. It was a bold construct whose parts are still employed to this day, and we have influenced a new generation of scholarship in the Seleukids, but also the Hellenistic period more generally. Today, the study of the period is defined largely by dynamic multiplicity that makes its study both daunting and infinitely rewarding as new parts are added and stitched by a variety of scholars. It is an environment that is particularly enriched by diversity in its scholars and approaches producing new constructs, sharing the ultimate hope that we may recreate a singular breath of the ancient being. I should note, if you want to know more, Ezequiel Martín Parra from La Universidad Nacional de Córdoba wrote his thesis on this relational nature of Hellenistic culture, and I'm thankful he offered to share his research last week. It's in Spanish, but all classicists should be familiar with that academic language. Well then, I have talked enough of others. It is time to offer up my own pound of flesh. This is very much a work in progress, spun from my interest in Seleukid legality, archives, and subjects within my dissertation. So I thank you in advance for any thoughts you may have. In a line attributed to two separate Frenchmen, either Voltaire or Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, it is said that where some states possess an army, the Prussian army possesses a state. I'm unconcerned with the veracity of such an indictment of Prussian militarism, but I am interested in this notion of martial impetus that not only undergirds, but also drives, directs, and defines the state. Such considerations are further exacerbated, complicated, when we remind ourselves that ancient states were unable to muster the same resources and coercive power as a modern nation state, due to, among many other things, technological limitations. Moreover, scholars are recognizing that even exemplary states, like the darling of centralization that is Louis XIV in France, fail to fully meet ideal criteria under close scrutiny. One aspect that has been discussed at length, mostly pertaining to the Roman Empire, is the role that ancient militaries played in not only the physical displacement of subjects' bodies during campaigns and garrison duties across the empire, but also the conditioning of soldiers into the greater mechanisms of the state through participation in the army and their subsequent effects on local societies. In our picture of the ancient state as intrinsically weaker than the modern, the military provides an avenue to examine the ancient state at the supposed apex of its power, a point upon which its gaze, if you allow me some Scott, is at its sharpest, if nothing else, for fear of usurpation. Today, I want to probe the idea of participation in the Seleukid army as a medium through which both king and the disparate populations of the empire are unified, and the subsequent effects this participation had on the inner workings and societal structuring of the empire. As you can tell, this is very much a post-dissertation project. Well, the study of the Seleucid Empire has enjoyed a large uptick in the last 30 years or so. Treatments on the army are sorely needed. To be sure, many discussions touch upon the army, but there is less published currently on this aspect than, say, the Roman Republican or Imperial or Ptolemaic army. For instance, much has been rightfully said about the itinerant nature of the Seleukid court, moving and stationing itself at a variety of points throughout the empire at different times. However, let us not only think of the physical movement of the king and the elites, but the armed forces and the army followers, wives, traders, children, sex workers that accompanied him, since many of these instances of movements are in the context of an armed response to an emerging external or internal threat. The inherent bellicosity that fueled Hellenistic empires demanded careful consideration and usage of available manpower and the collation of systems that allowed for the incorporation and mobilization of substantial segments of their population. This is further compounded by the need for local garrisons and police forces. Examples from both Ptolemaic Egypt and modern America showing how interlaced policing forces are with the military. No such treatment exists for the Seleucids due to the inherent dearth of sources when compared to those afforded to Ptolemaic and Roman scholars, but the rich amount of new approaches in Seleukid studies begs us to re-examine the role of the army beyond its battlefield composition and efficacy to trace its impact on the populations and administrations of the empire. Those are very purposeful plurals. In effect, instilling the construct with movement with breath. A large hurdle that we have seen faced by Rostovtsev, Kurt, and Sherwin-White is the preponderance of Greco-Roman literary accounts as the largest body of evidence for the Seleukid army. These accounts are written by authors, either spatially or temporally, outside of the empire, namely the likes of Polybius, Livy, Appian, Athenaeus, Plutarch, Polyaenus, and many others. No, not many. Now, this is not to say that they were ill-informed. Most had access to Hellenistic works that are lost to us, but we must be mindful of certain Greco-Roman historiographical tropes that very often purposefully emphasize ethnic divisions in armies, especially those from trans-regional polities broadly conceived of in the Greco-Roman mindset as Eastern. This point is all too familiar to those who are currently studying the Achaemenid military. To visualize this, on the screen I have mapped out the contingents mentioned as participating under Antiochus III at the Battle of Raphia, according to Polybius. Curiously, the Cardaces are mentioned, who appear to have also been used by the Achaemenids, according to Arrian, in the Battle of Issos and Gaugamela, and fought in the hoplite phalanx. In this composite sketch of spatial extent and demographic heterogeneity, the army becomes a catalog of empire, often intentionally juxtaposed with a Greek or Roman army. Livy, for instance, relates that the Lesser Scipio sought the title of Asiaticus after defeating Antiochus III by claiming that he technically fought all of Asia, since Antiochus's army had auxiliaries of all the peoples from the furthest stretch of the east. By highlighting differences, one is left with an impression of the resources of the empire and some knowledge of the army composition, sure, but it does little to flesh out the mechanisms in the army by which internal cohesion is fomented and maintained, especially in the bellicose Hellenistic period, where armies were more professionalized and conflict all the more common. With that, let us turn to the quintessential Macedonian troop of the Hellenistic period, the Phalangite. When we sing of arms, we sing of the men that wore them. Panoply and ethnicity are two aspects that are often inextricable in both ancient and modern historiography. After the military reforms of Philip II and the subsequent conquest and death of Alexander, the Hellenistic world emerged following roughly 20 years of bloodshed that will leave an irremovable ruddy stain on the subsequent polities that now dotted the multipolar Mediterranean. These successors naturally made use of their available veterans as the backbone of their military. However, they not only had to look to present reserves of manpower, but also think about future sources. Previous scholarship has largely favored the policy of implementing katoikiai, colonies of soldiers being granted land inside the empire in exchange for continued military service. However, newer scholarship has pushed back against ascribing a solely military nature to these colonies and their use of what amounts to breeding grounds for ethnically Macedonian soldiers. Even the terminology that we use, colonies, it carries a certain European colonial baggage. The traditional model is problematic for a variety of reasons, the most apparent one being the conflation between the professional and ethnical label of Macedonian and the expansion of the Katoikiai system, or something similar, beyond the region where most of the evidence is found, Asia Minor. This is not to say, of course, that there were no Greeks or Macedonians inhabiting settlements in the Seleucid Empire, far from that. When our sources use Macedonians, however, we must be wary of ascribing too harshly an ethnic component to what may be a way of stating a particular designation for a phalangite outfitted in the Macedonian manner, as Polybius makes clear in this mention of a Seleukid contingent at the Battle of Raphia in 217, though at other points he does use the blanket term, and is attested in Livy. Much of this is the result of an antagonistic framing between the Macedonians and the indigenous populations on the assumption that, and I quote one of the former leading historians on Seleucid military, Barkovka, arming the Orientals with heavy weapons would have laid the Seleucids open to the constant danger of native uprising, unquote. Those that know Ptolemaic history may be familiar with a similar adversarial framing that has been complicated by recent treatments on the evolution of the clericy system, showing greater interlacing between the Ptolemaic soldiery and local populations, especially after reforms to native recruitment in the 2nd century. I will touch on this question of loyalty later, but if we follow this sharp ethnic delineation between the core Macedonians and the rest of the Seleucid army, it would amount to negligence on the part of the state towards the large amount of available manpower dispersed throughout the empire, a state which could routinely field armies ranging from 50,000 to 80,000 troops, as modern quantitative studies have estimated. This, coupled with the frequency with which Seleucid monarchs and generals were on campaign, demands a reconsideration of Seleucid manpower pools and the greater professionalization of their soldiery when compared to the Ptolemies. A further wrinkle, Josephus, in his accounts of the Seleucid army, as far as I've been able to tell, uses Macedonians to denote the Seleucids and their armies, i.e. the armies or soldiers of the Macedonians. This is, of course, emblematic of a certain us versus them posturing in the construction of Hasmonean historiography, but we should not entirely discount the image of a monolithic Seleucid army by an author better geographically, culturally, and temporally situated to comment on it. He does use the term Greek, Macedonians, and Syrians, themselves being incredibly blanket terms that we just throw out there very frequently, for populations in Seleucid cities, but the armed forces are relatively uniform. Speaking of Syrians, curiously, Plutarch and Livy both include a mention within a purported speech of Flamininus, a typical Roman smarmy retort after Antiochus III's representatives finished listing off all the peoples within the Seleucid army. Quote, for the various types of armament and the many names of unheard of people, the Daci, the Caduceans, the Elamians, are all Syrians, far better slaves than soldiers due to their servile nature, unquote. I mentioned this not as damning evidence, but to underscore just how easily these optics can be manipulated between panoply and ethnicity in our sources. Syria, more specifically northern Syria, was indeed the site of intense urbanization by the Seleucids, ever since Seleucus I founded the famed Syrian tetrapolis of Antiochia, Apamea, Seleucia Pieria, and Laodicea. But local peoples did not just disappear, and new archaeological findings have stressed the continued presence and relevance of pre-existing communities in relation to Seleucid polyadic foundations. Even if we do allow for such a sharp ethnic divide, is it wise to hedge your bets on generational continuity of one dominant ethnic class for your main infantry force, especially given the randomness of casualties, rates of childhood death in antiquity, and the impact that mobilization would have on the running of communities and cities? Would these Macedonians only marry other Macedonians? A counterexample frequently noted is the marriage of Seleucus I to Apama, the daughter of the Sogdian noble Spitamenes, which produced Antiochus I. Moreover, it is becoming ever more apparent that non-Macedonians had substantial roles in the Seleucid administration at almost every level, to say nothing of the ability to hold both a Greek name and a native one, providing further onomastic complications to the evidence that we do have. It might surprise some of you that I just now mentioned Babylonia. There are no forces from Babylonia attested to in extant literature, an oddity given the region frequently noted by scholars for its relative loyalty to the Seleukid diadem and passivity throughout the Seleukid period. David Engels has recently re-examined the evidence from Hellenistic Babylonia, and while finding no definitive documentation for Seleukid levying of forces, specifically Babylonians, into the phalanx, he has also found nothing disproving this, and has underscored the peculiarity of the Seleucids not recruiting from one of their most loyal and administratively developed regions. We also, similar to ancient authors, emphasize the phalanx, but while composing a substantial chunk of the army, they would flounder if not supported by other forces. Cavalry and ranged troops, in addition to mercenaries, made up substantial segments of Seleukid forces, and we should not grant primacy to the phalanx while minimizing the size and importance of auxiliary forces, which were very likely not excluded from grants of land and garrison policing duties. For instance, Antiochus III purportedly moved Jewish families from Babylon into Phrygia to bolster local security in that region. It is thus difficult to extricate the realities of the Seleukid army from our literary sources, which are laden with storied and problematic historiographical baggage. There is further regularity with the uses of professional and ethnic designation of Macedonians when describing a key component of the Seleukid army, the phalanx. I have limited my discussion to the phalangites because they are such an emblematic aspect of the story that we tell of this empire, supported by an ethnically distinct base of loyal Macedonians. Mercenaries and affiliated troops, however, could move into Seleukid territory and become participants in civic and social life. For example, we have mentions of Galatians and Thracians dwelling within the territorial bounds of the empire, so my mapping of these forces in this map as inherently outside of the Seleukid Empire was intentionally misleading to underscore the faults in spatially mapping ethnonyms. Moreover, and I thank Michael Taylor for the suggestion in private correspondence, the Seleucids adopted equipment from subaltern groups, the thureophoroi from the Galatians and the cataphract armor from Central Asia. It is fair to say that our picture of the Seleukid military as one dominated by the sharp unilateral settler dynamic is at least questionable, due to the deficiencies in our ancient literary evidence, newer considerations and evidence of the working of the Seleukid state, and the subsequent role of subject peoples in its governance. Are there any avenues left for us to examine this question? Material culture is one aspect that has been mostly discussed in terms of reconstructing the actual panoply of soldiers to find specific units, but less in terms of the incorporation of military ideology and practices in Seleukid society, or actually societies might be more apt. Excavations in Babylon, Seleukid on the Tigris, Uruk, and Nippur have yielded a substantial number of terracotta figurines over the years. Among those found are depictions of deities, women, couples in flagrante delicto, and soldiers. Those familiar with the region know that martial figurines have a storied tradition, especially horse riders. Such horse rider figurines are present during the Seleukid period, but changes in both depiction and production occur. Handmade figures continue to be produced with variations. Figures from Babylon have traditional peaked hats and long beards, but some in Uruk are adorned with a flat-top hat that conforms more to the petasos hat worn by Macedonian cavalry. These are then supplemented by molded figures following Greek practices from Seleukid on the Tigris, a Seleukid foundation to be sure, but one whose population was buttressed very early on by the state-ordered movement of peoples from nearby Babylon. And of course, people move on their own volition also. As Stephanie Langenhuber has noted in her excellent monograph on Hellenistic figurines from Babylonia, published in 2020, I believe, these objects frequently incorporate a mixture of local and Hellenistic features during this period, most notably in their clothing. Even those that we may label as more traditional do not carry many sharp cultural features, and the very act of defining them on ethnic terms is inherently difficult. A plaque from Kampir Tepe in modern Uzbekistan features a similar composite uniform, the one here displaying likely a Bactrian soldier with a xiphos, a corselet, and the teriges of Greek design, and a pointed helm found in Urartian, Assyrian, and Achaemenid art. Such blendings are likely an indicator of a greater sensitivity towards the multicultural realities of the Seleukid Empire among its population and among its soldiery. While the figurines are toys, largely meant for children to play with, given their find spots are mostly in residential areas or in refuse heaps, we should not discredit the effects these may have had on the perception of the Seleucid army based on age alone. Children grow, and as Langdon Hooper concludes, quote, thus the combination of intimacy and engagement seductively offered by interactive horse rider figurines can be understood both as a vehicle for the creation of a private refuge, and yet, at the same time, as a subtle, perhaps even insidious, tool for the dissemination of the broader social contract. End note. In some ways, I am reminded of the little American green plastic GIs and M48 patent tanks that I routinely played with as a child in Puerto Rico, and you can find in any store. Similarly, we also use American currency, and Seleukid subjects found themselves using gradually more and more coinage of varying denominations. Quantitative studies have made it more apparent that monetization was not defined by a singular wide-sweeping enactment in the Seleucid Empire. It came gradually, both in terms of time and space. The prime movers of monetization being two culprits. One, urbanization, that brings an increased presence of markers, mints, pencil pushers, land exploitation, taxes, and legal contracts. And second, the army. The role of the army is even more pronounced in the spreading of bronze coinage, denoted by its fiduciary value as opposed to gold and silver, which held inherent value. It is unsurprising, then, that many Seleucid bronzes feature martial iconography, since their usage seems to have been primarily for the payment of troops. Even devoid of immediate martial context, the imagery itself may clue us in on the ways that the Seleucid army and its leaders wanted to be perceived. I am sure you're all familiar with imagery of elephants, helmets, Athena, Nike in her role as conferrer of military victories, but we also have bows, a relatively untraditional weapon, at least in the idealistic depiction of Greek martial excellence focused on close combat, used by both Apollo and also as lone objects on coins. Much has been said about Apollo in the Seleukid sphere, but it bears repeating that it finds echoes in previous Achaemenid iconography of kings as archers. A flex of the bow is a flex of one's martial virtue, and the design would be continued by the Arsacids after the Seleucids. While there is no direct image, at least to my knowledge, I would love to find one, of a Seleukid king using a bow, we must not assume that everyone who saw the image recognized Apollo instead of the king, and very frequently royal iconography invited a melding of the mortal and the divine. Apollo's curls could even be read as mimicking the tassels of the royal diadem, and his nudity conforms with the heroic nudity in Greek art and all these bronze statues that must have existed in antiquity of Hellenistic royals in the New. I mean, we have the spear leaner. Studies on the coinage of Seleukid kings. Oh, pardon me. There seems to be one of my bronze coins up there has apparently disappeared. Studies on the coinage of Seleukid kings by Joseph and Lorber have revealed a further fascinating change in the self-depiction of kings: facial hair. It has been posited this reflects the king performing an oath during a campaign, only shaving once the campaign is over. This stems from the particularly Greek tradition of ex voto, but it nevertheless shows a commitment on the part of the king to represent himself beyond the idealistic youthful framing of other portrait types in a direct appeal to the soldiers, likely preceded by some sort of ceremony where the army would assemble to spectate and then be paid in coins which commemorate this event. Again, none of this is damning evidence, but it does allow for the existence of multiple strands of meaning within martial iconography beyond traditional Macedonian readings among the disparate populations of the empire. Even the king's appearance could alter to show his connection to the army through the growing of facial hair or the inclusion of specific weapons. One cannot also discount the role of military payments in monetizing regions of the Seleucids, as is especially noticeable in Coeli Syria and Phoenicia during the 2nd century, when the Seleucid administration opted to intensify the administration of this area while their eastern and western territories dwindled. In zones with lower monetization, which may have constituted actually an incredibly sizable portion of the empire, it would be remiss not to mention how impactful the injections of coinage from troops, either returning home or garrisoning communities, would have been to local economic ecologies. I think these varying points will be best further fleshed out by examining the available inscriptions. Oh, there it is. Sorry about that. I didn't even know I animated it. But yeah, that's Seleucus II with sporting one heck of a beard, and note the bow on the reverse. Given the problems I have stated as present in our literary records of the Seleukid army, I am sure it will not surprise you to note that there are also problems with their epigraphic evidence. OGIS 229 details the Sympoliteia, the merger of Smyrna, a loyal Seleukid ally, and Magnesia at Sipylum under the reign of Seleucus II. In this complex, ever fascinating, transferring of rights between two communities, certain troops are given citizenship and some other rights, including land. The Smyrnians single out a troop led by Timon, taken from the phalanx, and one led by Omanes, described as a Persian who led a contingent of Persians. While likely confirmation of the inclusion of Persians in the Seleukid army, we should not read this document, drafted by the Smyrnians and produced within the context of their polyadic institutions, as an indicator of internal Seleukid attitudes toward the arrangement of troop roles and ethnic divisions, especially since a previous section of this very same document specified that Smyrnian citizenship would only be granted to Magnesians who were free and Greek, and thus Omanes and his troops demanded to be singled out as exceptions within their legal writing. Similarly, the only epigraphic evidence that we have for Seleukid soldier associations, Hoina, Pralita Mata, both of these terms are used to a certain degree, of Macedonians, comes from the early reign of Seleucus I in the city of Thyatira in western Anatolia. Even then, as is the case with the more numerous inscriptions we have for the Ptolemaic army, these ethnic associations and their dedicatory inscriptions, usually for a commanding officer of the current royal family, should not be grafted wholesale onto the internalized frameworks of armies or assumed to be monolithic. People can join these groups and assume a communal identity, especially for a broader determiner like Macedonian compared to some examples from Ptolemaic Egypt, like the Polytelma of the Boeotians. Moreover, these inscriptions were drafted when the Seleukid Empire was in its infancy, and its army was at its most likely to have veterans from previous campaigns. These are mostly the inscriptions cited by scholars working on this material, but I think that we can press this a little bit more. Two interrelated texts were drafted by Antiochus III and likely Zeuxis, the regional Seleukid governor, concerning the conferral of Asilia towards the temple at Amazon in Caria, with instructions directly addressed to the army to respect the inviolability of the temple and its environs by not billeting and despoiling the region. Note they are addressed broadly, only by rank, officers, and roles, infantry and cavalry, with the extant portion of the second document employing the second person plural humes. Contrary to previous examples, these are internal documents whose words explicitly refer to the army in a homogeneous manner, defined by rank and roles, the larger unifying characteristic being their assumed compliance with the legislation of the Seleukid state as subjects. Similarly, the so-called Hepzibah dossier features a series of letters between Antiochus III and Ptolemaios, a former Ptolemaic strategos and high priest of Coele and Phoenicia, who switched to the Seleukid side sometime during the Fifth Syrian War. The crux of the dossier deals with the confirmation of Ptolemaios' rights over villages he possessed formerly under the Lagids and now is the Seleukid high official of the area. Given that the region was won by conquest, it should not surprise you all to learn that many of his grievances were against soldiers and military officials who frequented the region due to its importance now as a strategic corridor between Ptolemaic and Seleukid territory. Many were likely also in nearby garrisons or settlements, and there was always the possibility of permanent settler garrisons also. Similar to the Temple of Amazon, legal rights are sought against billeting and general despoliation, in addition to concerns that garrison commanders might not be taking local legal cases seriously. Unlike Amazon, it is not directly addressed to the soldiery, but this is unsurprising given that the dossier is a series of exchanges between Ptolemaios and Antiochus, and Ptolemaios' grievances appear to specifically target officials and commanders to rein in the soldiers under their command. These officers, similar to Amazon, are abstracted and defined by their office. We must also recognize that these inscriptions carry not only immediate legal force, but they can also be referred to after the events are over. That spurred their creation as standing monuments with multiple copies. I will happily, it's the subject of my discussion, I will happily talk more about copies and archiving, should anyone find interest in that. It should also not be lost to us that the garrison commanders are tasked with handling local disputes, providing a further avenue through which local populations and the military administration interacted that we are sadly not privy to because we just don't have this documentation with us. A newer inscription, pardon me, a newer inscription dated to the reign of Seleucus II during his eastern campaign from Basaida in the region of Media details the successful attempt by the community, described itself as those dwelling in the pasture land to be excused from the onus of billeting and providing services to soldiers. They appear to have been granted an earlier concession by Seleucus's grandfather, Antiochus I, and now seek it again. It is likely that these communities were responsible for the maintenance of horses that would subsequently be used in the cavalry of the Seleukid army. While fragmentary, it is highly likely that Seleucus granted these concessions to not only validate his grandfather's decision and thus his own rule, but also to ensure that local communities will continue to supply crucial horses and likely other creatures of burden for the army. The community likely held their contribution to the military as leverage for their claims, eliciting a response from the administration and the further codification of their rights. Interestingly, here's a bronze issue from the main Median Mint, Ecbatana, under Antiochus III, that features the king on the obverse and a mare with a suckling foal on the reverse. A curious choice that likely incorporates local horse-rearing traditions and roles within the Seleukid military into an object of the state, whose martial context is further underscored if we recall that the main reason for bronze issues was payments to soldiers, likely here during Antiochus's eastern campaign. Another community, this time the Sidonians dwelling in the port of Iamnia, sought exemption from taxes under Antiochus V due to their naval service under his grandfather Antiochus III. The Sidonians are famed sailors and likely formed a crucial part of the Seleukid navy. And if you think that the army is underrepresented in our modern and ancient sources, boy, don't even look at the navy. Both of these examples show that local contributions to or direct service in the armed forces could come with benefits. It is, however, more than just simply an instance of quid pro quo. Communities reaped immediate benefits, but also became active participants in the structures of the Seleukid administration through their codification of rights into law that could only be upheld if the state was recognized as legitimate authority and subjects interacted with the validifying institutions and records of the state. A final and admittedly tenuous example, again, this is all work in progress. Among the slew of deities worshipped in the Seleukid Empire, one in particular has been tied to the military, Heracles. Joan Breton Connolly, in her study of votive figurines of Heracles in the island of Failaka in the Persian Gulf during the Hellenistic period, has noted that Heracles' cult is appealing to soldiers due to its inherent movability, as opposed to cults that emphasize a particular grounded sacred space. Heracles wanders, and so do soldiers, especially Seleukid soldiers. Heraclean imagery also factors into Seleukid royal martial ideology, linked not only to Imitatio Alexandri, but also to several indigenous deities within the empire. Heracles, similar to Dionysus, was an infinitely mutable mythic warrior hero. I bring up Heracles because I'm interested in revisiting the Bisotun Heracles, the only extant Seleukid rock carving in the Iranian plateau. Depicted as nude and reclining in a style that has been labeled as more Iranian than Greek, the bearded Heracles has laid up his arms, which feature a very familiar bow and quiver, and is celebrating a victory with a feast. The accompanying inscription, written in both Aramaic and Greek, states that this is Heracles Kalinikos, who has been commissioned by Hyacinthus for the safety of Cleomenes, the governor of the upper satrapies. As Strootman notes, we cannot fully be sure that these are Greeks, due to the onomastic murkiness, given the reality that names could be as much indicators of affiliation with the empire as statements on ethnic identity, in addition, again, to the inclusion of the Aramaic. Matthew Canepa has also made the claim that this was designed to be an open-air sanctuary, and the epithet Kalinikos, gloriously triumphant, was used not only as an epithet of Heracles in Greece, but also given as an epithet to Seleukid kings. Lucian even states Macedonian soldiers conferred this title to Antiochus I after his battle with the Galatians. It was commissioned shortly before the Arsacids conquered the region, giving its purpose of ensuring the safety of the Seleukid governor a very pressing martial meaning, since the governor was also the highest regional military commander. Given these aspects, I've included the Bisotun Heracles as another example of a purposeful blending of culture in the upper levels of the military administration as a possible indicator of cultic activity tied to the Seleucid army, and a further testament to the culturally composite nature through which participation in the army could manifest. He is no different than the Seleukid king donning a beard or bow, and is telling he is the face of Seleukid presence in Bisotun, dotted with the Achaemenid, Arsacid, and Sassanid reliefs of imperial and religious might. A final little exciting note, I stumbled upon a news article detailing the very recent, late 2022, finding of a sling bullet, tentatively dated to the 2nd century BCE in modern Yavne, roughly 18 miles south of Tel Aviv. Latin and Greek sources called Yavne Iamnia, the very same city we discussed previously that was under Seleukid rule in this period. In Greek, on the sling bullet are the words Nike, victory, and on the reverse side of Heracles and Hauronas, the latter being an attested deity of local Levantine importance, whose pairing with Heracles is further attested to in an Hellenistic inscription from Delos set up by the Yamnians themselves. Now, let us be quick to temper our excitement. With the Delian inscription, it is clear that the worship of Heracles among the Yamnians went beyond the martial sphere, but I nevertheless find the articulation of worship through the very tangible medium of military equipment to be teasing the ways the local could overlap with participation in the military. I recognize that what I have presented is a scattering of parts with glimmers of some greater construct. This is both due to the nature of our evidence and also the various ways that the Seleukid army affected the lives of subjects. First and foremost, it is increasingly clear that the adversative model of governance upheld by a predominantly Macedonian infantry corps, strategically settled throughout the empire, does not likely reflect the full realities of Seleukid governance across all its history in all the regions, at least the regions that it directly governed, neither in terms of ideological nor pragmatic policies. And I believe that we can talk of subject participation within the workings of the Seleukid army in a similar vein that scholarship has rightfully discussed elite participation in the Seleukid administration. As Fischer-Beauvais notes in her cross-comparative study of revolts in the Seleukid and Ptolemaic empires, periods of ethnic unrest are surprisingly few, interior violence almost always stemming from dynastic conflict for the Seleucids. Indeed, as the Seleukid line fractured in the 2nd century, the role of the army became ever more prominent in validating central authority and displayed moments of communal rallying around a particular claimant, similar to what occurs later on in the Roman Empire. It was a force invested in the state because it relied on it for payment and property, not due to some notion of ethnic Macedonian loyalty, and the Seleucids did not limit these generosities to only the Macedonian element within their empire. This constitutes my attempt at laying the groundwork for such a construct on the social dynamics behind the army, and there are even further aspects to consider when we think of the lives of soldiers. For instance, a recent 2021 analysis of archaeobotanical material in the settlement of Nisa Scythopolis in Koili, Syria, which was garrisoned by Seleukid soldiers and likely their families in the 2nd century, shows the complex interlacing between soldiers and locals. When I first read the findings that the plant material was local and thus the soldiers' diet was largely derived from their immediate environments, I thought something to the effect of, well, yes. However, taken with related evidence from the site of amphorae from places like Rhodes, Seleucid coins, and the use of local building techniques with mud brick, a more dynamic picture emerges of, as the authors call it, a complex adoption model for Seleukid settlers and soldiers that features more intense interactions with local peoples. This is the sort of material that gets us ever closer to recreating that singular breath in our ancient construct. To conclude my cursory study, I very much realize that I am standing here, hands empty, without a smoking gun to reveal. However, I do think we are uniquely poised to revisit this question in light of new evidence and approaches towards the Hellenistic period and the Seleucid Empire more specifically, disparate parts brought together in a singular construct. It could penetrate multiple societal strata, from the king's own self-depiction to the playthings of children. Moreover, soldiers received payments in Seleukid money, could be tasked with garrison duty, and could obtain land in return for their service, affecting local social, economic, and legal communities after demobilization. This is in addition to their likely use of as policing forces. Participation in the army could also grant communities certain legal rights or even validate authority claims of regional power holders. I began this keynote with talk of constructs, so I will return to this now. The excellent papers that will follow in the next few days are emblematic of this dynamism of scholarship, a sort of a grander construct we are all aiding in, and that I think lies at the root of what this conference aims to do: present raw research and ideas from younger scholars, as Samuel noted in his introduction. We will hear further talks of onomastics and romanization with Alex's paper. Patrick will present a comparative study of music between Greece and China. Nana will discuss antiquity with Soviet animation. Tom will tackle Strabo's construction of barbarism, a topic ever close to my heart. Alessandro will bridge the gap between Homer and late antiquity through Rutilius Nematianus. Andreas and Gianluca will both be discussing Medea, a figure whose mutability across time and culture shows her continued appeal. Lorenzo will discuss that ever-tricky notion of identity in the late Republic. Clara Manuel will show how poetry can shed further light on gender and sexuality and the social structures hidden behind lines of poetry. Nia will have us hearing echoes of ancient choruses in T.S. Eliot. Victor will recreate a vital portion of ancient life with an examination of the cult of the Muses at Thespiae. And of course, today, following me, we will have Alexandra present on the diffusion of gladiators in the eastern portion of the empire, and Morena will correlate power and emotion in the lives of Plutarch, an aspect that I'm very much looking forward to hearing about. Well then, I'm sure you're all tired of my voice. I certainly am. A singular parting shot. Many of the questions I have posed today are a result of engaging more with scholarship on the history of Puerto Rican participation in the U.S. Army. This is my pound of flesh, a very real, tangible flesh. I had some small lines here and there saying as much. Of course, the situation should not be seen as wholly analogous, but still interesting to think about when thinking of military equipment, the person behind it, and their relationship with empire. Note here, for instance, the elements of the Puerto Rican National Guard are wearing U.S. combat uniforms while playing tamborines, palitos, maracas, and even a guiro in the back. The jovial mood is undercut almost immediately when you read the caption and you realize that they are visiting Guantanamo Bay. A reminder that participation in the military can easily integrate subjects into the mechanisms that replicate, fabricate, and validate empire. Are they Puerto Ricans or Americans? Are Seleukid soldiers Macedonians or indigenous? I do not know, and I fear that is the point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. That was a very interesting keynote. I'm gonna stop the recording now.